Good morning, everyone. I'm sitting here live with Professor David Staley of Ohio State University, and we're talking about the future of higher education this morning. But before I dive into that, I just want to thank Milan Global, my collaborator for this podcast. And I want to acknowledge P. They're the project manager for this podcast. And P is really passionate about storytelling. P's a great artist. They're also a designer, and I'm just so lucky to have P on board. And they'll probably be putting some comments in and joining as much as possible from the background. But I wanted to just acknowledge all the work that P's put into this for today. And now I'm going to just introduce my guest. Dr. David Staley is an associate professor in the Department of History. Oh, I should probably say who I am too. I'm Melinda McClymans, and this is the We're Nearly There podcast. So we're just, really trying to platform people doing great work to bring in the future we're all that we all want, that we're trying to create together. And so my guest today is Dr. David Staley, and he's an associate professor in the departments of history, design, and educational studies at The Ohio State University. He's the author of Alternative Universities, Speculative Design for Innovation in Higher Education. He's the co-author of Knowledge Towns, Colleges and Universities as Talent Magnets, and author of Visionary Histories, a collection of future essays. He's an honorary faculty fellow at the Center for Higher Education Leadership and Innovative Practice at Bay Path University, and a fellow at the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. He writes the monthly Futures column Next for Columbus Underground, for which he was awarded Best Freelance Writer by the Ohio Society of Professional Journalists in 2022. And so welcome, Dr. Staley, David. Hi, how are you?
I'm doing fine. As I was saying before we went on the air, I'm not necessarily a morning person, so I think all things considered, I'm doing pretty well this morning.
Well, I totally respect that. I just want you to know, as a morning person, I recognize that many people are not morning people, and please forgive me for being perky or morning person like during our conversation today, because I know it can get on people's nerves if they're not morning people. So we only have an hour, actually a little bit less than that now. And so I just wanted to go over a couple things. I wanted to kind of tap into your thinking around anarchy. I'm really excited to talk about that and kind of, dispel some of the concepts around that and talk about it as a possible future for humanity and what leadership looks like in that. And then I wanted to talk about education within that and maybe get into the role of technology, including old-fashioned physical technologies that we're all, accustomed to using, such as the classroom. And I have a couple other things we may get to, may not. So for just to get started, would you kind of share what is appealing about anarchy as a system and what that would look like?
Yeah, it is, I think, really good to start with definitions, because I think that a lot of people sort of associate anarchy or anarchism or anarchists with sort of violence and sort of brutal or sort of chaotic violence. And sort of historically, that's not what the term is meant. Proudhon was one of the advocates in the 19th century, who argued that that anarchism is simply action or governance without the compulsion of some sort of higher authority. usually the state or something like that. So I mean, it's actually about governance. It's actually about order, but that order comes from, I guess, what we would call the ground up or from the grassroots. It's another way of thinking of it as a kind of self-organizing. So in other words, we don't need the permit, whoever we is, we don't need the permission of some higher or hierarchical authority, giving laws or telling us what to do. We can sort of self-organize and govern ourselves, as it were. And so that's the sense of anarchy that I've become interested in. I want to state up front and sort of categorically, I don't think of myself as an anarchist, but I've become very interested in anarchy, especially as a way to think about the organization of or the governance, the leadership of organizations. I know you learned of my interest in this topic from a talk I gave
Yes.
back in September, where I talked about that the university needs more anarchy.
Yes. Yes.
The
Yes.
university as a whole, not necessarily the university that employs us, but that anarchy is maybe a more fitting way of thinking about leadership and organization of the university.
Yeah. And what I really liked about it is, I mean, I love this, that really it's about rules, actually. Like,
It
we think
is,
anarchy is the absence of rules, but you talked about how it's each other, ourselves, deciding what our rules are for ourselves. It's coming from within ourselves.
yeah.
And I think that's so interesting.
Yeah, it's sort of like you putting together this podcast. This was sort of your decision, your initiative, right?
Yeah.
You didn't, well, you weren't acting out of someone else's authority or order. And I'm presuming here, Melinda, you didn't necessarily ask for permission either. You just do it, right?
Well, who would I ask? I mean,
Exactly. Yes.
yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's actually, from my field, my background in education, there are levels of development, like cognitive development. I'm not an expert in it, but that's the time-worn caveat of the academic. I'm not an expert in it, but
Right.
it's like, there are levels of development in terms of how power is perceived. So, um, it's a challenge and like a lifelong process to master the idea that power comes from within, or like, um, you don't have to look to parents or authorities or institutions for permission or for what to do next or for leadership. Which was my next question, which was like, what does leadership look like in this context that's more kind of decentralized, more anarchic, if you will?
It's a good question, and one I think that I'm still wrestling with and struggling with. Um, it implies that that leadership is more situational, that the leader is defined in a more sort of situational fashion, as opposed to having sort of title permanently affixed next to
Mm,
person. So this person is leader or president or manager or whatever the case is. I
yes.
think it also, since I've used the word self-organization to describe this, I think that leaders emerge. Leadership is, in a sense, a sort of an emergent property of self-organizing systems. If I can borrow the terminology from complexity theory. So that there are leaders, but leadership in that context isn't of the type of sort of, again, command and control, telling you what to do, commanding you what to do. I tend to think of
Yeah.
leadership in that setting as more like cultivation and care. That the
Mm,
leader is one who is like a gardener, sort of creates the conditions for others to thrive. And
I
so
love that
yeah, it's a
image.
very different notion
It's
of
very
how we
different.
how we think about and reward
It's an
leadership.
easygoing leader, kind of, or but
Yeah,
yet hardworking and productive. I don't know. Yeah, I like that metaphor. That's a great image. I mean, because I think hierarchy, in my mind, and maybe just culturally, is highly associated with a military structure. And so
indeed.
many of our metaphors are military, like have you got my back? I mean, have you got my six? There's just so many constantly that I use. I'm guilty of it, and everyone uses, because we're that thinking. And I think you use the term managerial thinking, at your keynote conversation. So yeah, very highly contrasting.
And I'm tipping my hand a little too much when I describe sort of managerial thinking. Maybe I'm revealing too much of my own sort of bias about or bias against that sort of managerial thinking. So I haven't read the book, but I plan to read the book. It's a business book that's just come out recently, and I'm searching my phone for the title. I thought I had it here ready at hand, but it's essentially an argument in favor of managers, especially middle managers in
Okay.
organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of what I was doing in that keynote, I think, was sort of pushing back against the idea that organizations need, especially middle management, but maybe even just the idea of management as a whole. And this is the book saying, yes, we still need managers, and managers in this sense of sort of telling people what to do, organizing the process. And again, what I was sort of laying out in that keynote for the Dow City conference, or City DAO conference, was what if we thought about a university, or indeed any sort of organization, as being more like Burning Man?
Mm-hmm. I wish I could bring up that image. Yeah, that was a beautiful image of, I mean, basically a spontaneous city, as you pointed out, and it's like circular. It's a circular layout. It's fascinating design, like the pattern of Burning Man, like from an aerial view, like it looks like a big circle, but with sort of, very hard to describe, but
and 40,000
beautiful.
people. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
it's not a small cadre or something. We're talking about a kind of self-organization, and maybe I'm overstating somewhat. There's been a need for a kind of leadership or management, but Burning Man looks very different from most organizations, and frankly, even most universities. And what I advocated in that talk was, when I say we need more anarchy in the university, is that we need more of that self-organization, that end of managerialism, and indeed a very different way of thinking about what academic leadership is.
Yeah. I mean, more of a grassroots sort of, like you said, emergent leadership. Like, so it's sort of like the leadership would encapsulate or surround the activities that arise as a result of consensus, I guess.
Can I describe one of the chapters in my book?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's absolutely on point here. And I don't know if I used the word anarchy. In fact, I'm pretty certain I didn't use the word anarchy when I wrote it. But so this book is a collection of 10 different models for how we could reorganize universities.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the chapters is called Platform University. What if we ran the university like a two-sided platform? And the analogy, I guess, I draw, or one of the analogies, is Wikipedia. Wikipedia is an example of a two-sided platform. So the decision about which articles to create or to post on Wikipedia is not determined by some sort of hierarchical organization. It's determined by users. It's determined by people. I've decided I'm going to put up an article, and editing and other sorts of functions like that are done as a communal organization. Now, there has been an organization that emerges, or that has emerged, editors and others. But think about like here in Columbus, the North Market. The North Market is a kind of platform, and they set rules, they set some standards, but the purpose of the North Market is to provide a space for people who are selling things and people who are buying things, whether that's food or clothing or crockery, whatever the case may be, that the purpose of the North Market is to facilitate that exchange.
Yeah, like not to control everything, but to maybe tightly control very strategic things.
So what if we thought about a university as a platform for connecting teachers and learners?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I think it's inevitable with Web 3.0, and soon people will have digital backpacks that, and it's backpacks not a great metaphor, but that's what they're called a lot of times. But basically, you will have a record permanent in public but you can reveal as much or as little as you want in different contexts of it. But it's because of blockchain technology, it's trustless. So meaning it's been validated and it can follow you. So so now it's relevant for faculty as well. Like the idea of, free market, where people say, I'm a professor. No one needs, I don't need to ask someone to be called that anymore. Like it's in my backpack. Like you can see my record right here. I am an expert in this, and you can see my record right here on chain. Offer something in the free market or like the marketplace of learning. The students can then start also, learning and showing their mastery of the different subjects. And it's basically a co-creation of the learning and the content, and like things like content, curriculum, learning, like maybe they will all kind of take on new meanings.
And I've not seen one recently. I don't know if they're still the fashion, but have you ever participated in an unconference?
Yes.
I was
I like
imagining,
those because
yeah, me too.
I love conversation. I feel like I get into more insightful, like my own thinking gets developed further in those because the conversations are more free flowing. I like that. I like
So
that form.
when I was at California University, I use that analogy again more than anarchy. What if we organize the university like an unconference? And for any viewers that maybe are not certain what an unconference is, um, people arrive. We come to a location like any sort of conference, but the first act that takes place is we sort of decide what's the program going to look like. And so there's usually some sort of big board or something, and people write down, I will give a talk on this or such and such.
Mm-hmm.
And someone else will say, I'm going to give a talk on this. And you sort of array this on a board, and then you put it in time slots and those sorts of things. And then other participants, you and other participants, then say, all right, I'd be interested in going to that, or I'd be interested in going to that. And you sort of mark that out that way. And if a large enough group are interested in this topic, well, then that's now a session at the conference. And if this idea that you had,
Yes.
no one seems to be interested in it, then it doesn't get presented. And also one of the rules is you don't have to stick around. Just because you show up and said you'd be there doesn't mean you have to stay. You can get up and go to another session. But
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
conference, in a sense, is the very first act is to sort of organize what the conference is. And again, there's no sort of overarching hierarchy that's sort of structuring that. I've always found unconferences to be really, really exhilarating events.
Yeah. I've only been to a couple, and it was quite some time ago, but I can definitely relate to that. I'm a strategic doing practitioner, which is a basically the conversational technology for leadership, where you it's really focused on figuring out what is most doable and most impactful in the eyes of the group. Like you'll have a group conversation, and the whole process is to envision together what you can achieve based on what each of you bring to the table. And it's very exhilarating. Yeah, I agree. It's
You sound
the
like an
freedom. I think
advocate.
it's the freedom. It's more, it's I don't want to say stimulating, because that's also going back to like lecture format, sage on the stage. It's something's exhilarating when you can't predict. Yeah, that's what it is. I mean,
I was
in
going to say you sound
combination
like
with
an
some,
advocate. You
yes.
sound like an advocate for dialogue. as
Oh my
a
God,
sort of
that's
an
me.
academic practice?
That I mean, big time. And it's like a lifelong. I mean, some of my earliest memories were just kind of being, disappointed by people not wanting to go into deep conversation. Like, why?
Hmm.
you know, I really dig it. Yeah.
Well, and think about the sort of the practice of conversation, or what happens in a conversation. Um, on the one hand, it certainly means one person speaks, but for a conversation to be successful and enlivened, it also requires very active listening. And I
Yes.
sometimes think that that is not a value or a skill or a practice or an attribute that we value highly enough in the university, in the academy. I am
Absolutely.
paid to be a professor, right? To profess,
Right.
but not to be a listener.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, and I love that because I mean, what if there were what if there was a way to make visible listening? Like this again goes back to the backpacks. You know, like I have a track record of bringing enlivened conversation, like not with me, but um there's no word for it, like it's not the heroic kind of thing that people put on their resume, but yet, if you keep showing up, I just find if you keep showing up and make people feel heard, they just feel good. And they don't really know why, but they just do, and they want you to keep coming back. But there's no role, there's no pay raise for that. That's what is really missing in our system is, a more collective way to bring out people's assets in a way that they, will benefit from showing up and participating in that way. Um, yeah, but I mean, I don't want to digress too much, but yeah, I mean, one of the things I teach is I'm like, okay, ground rules and active listening, because dialogue's a part of my class, or I, promote that for, because at Ohio State, I work in international affairs. And so we do sometimes online forums, like between students in different countries. And so, that's incredibly important for online because then you don't have like facial expression, tone of voice, anything. So you really have to lean on the active listening, or else there can be a lot of misunderstandings.
I was just writing down something that you said just a moment ago. You said, well, I don't want to digress. But it strikes me that in any good conversation, conversation is all about digression.
Yes.
It's part of the sort of the emergent behaviors of a self-organizing system, which is what a good conversation is.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that's a really, yeah, I feel supported. I feel supported. Um, I guess I just want to make sure we do get to kind of the future of higher education, like what it'll look like you mentioned, like that very key role in our current technology of the classroom, which is the professor. Having a great orator, a great teacher, explaining stuff, or giving you those nuggets of knowledge in that way, and sort of students assiduously taking notes and studying what the lecture had in it. And that's um it's kind of what comes immediately to mind is the classroom with the sage on the stage. It's very core to our culture's thinking around education. Where do you see the classroom as, like, if you consider it a technology, like in the panoply of technologies, where do you see it in the future?
Wow, this is such a good question and such a complex question. So let me take it in a couple directions. Um, I think that like so many other things, the our experience of the pandemic um, laid bare a lot of our assumptions and asked us or forced us to ask a lot of questions about the nature of our systems. It's like the way my friends and colleagues in geography and transportation will say that when the snow falls and you see the traffic patterns, you see exactly how traffic actually moves, what cars actually use. Do we really need streets as wide as we make them when it's pretty clear, at least the snow reveals that that it's a very sort of different pattern. We could be redesigning our streets based on this. I think that's something that the pandemic did. It revealed something about the nature of the classroom. And one of the things I think that we experienced was, so we move all of our classes into Zoom. That was one of the immediate effects, and that was also, I
Yeah.
think, one of the things we did, I think, in the fall of 20, as a sort of continuation of
Well,
this.
and we did it midway through spring. I'll never
We
forget
did
that.
that.
That was
Yes, we
highly
pivoted in
stressful.
spring. Yes, very, very
That
stressful.
was really stressful.
And
Yes.
Melinda, part of the stress was, especially in large classes.
Oh,
There was a
yeah.
sense that Zoom just didn't work. And I'm this is not anti-Zoom. I am far from anti-Zoom. But if the class was more than 25 people, of course, the screen in Zoom can handle 25 screens or pictures. And then when you get that 26th, they're actually sort of off. You have to scroll. And so if a course was of any sort of appreciable size, it really could be a very disorienting, and it leads to a sort of a disinterestedness, I think, among students. I remember giving a guest lecture during this. My classes weren't that large, but I was giving a guest lecture in a Zoom class of, I don't know, probably about 60 students. And I remember, and I hope this person doesn't think I'm throwing them under the bus. I'm most certainly not. My eye kept being drawn to this one young lady who was affixing her mascara during my talk, and all I could see was her face like that. And that this is how this is what had happened during Zoom. But then I started to ask myself, how is 60 students in this big classroom an improvement on that? Is it really an improvement? And one of the things that we've done now, I've not seen sort of the action yet. This is going to be a long-term process, I think. But this would have been the summer of 21. There was a task force established here at Ohio State that was essentially looking at the future of classrooms after the pandemic. Do we need to redesign classrooms? And part of what we were discussing was, do we need to design classrooms to be hybrid? So in other words, there'll be a face-to-face component, but we have to be able to design the system to bring in people that are participating in the class remotely, more than just simply we'll have you here on Zoom and we'll
One or the other. It's
yeah.
both. Yeah.
But then the other conversation was, do we really need, or should we continue to have big lecture halls? Does a 300-person lecture hall still make sense pedagogically? And thus also architecturally, does that make sense? And I think that our group
Right.
was at least pushing back against that idea, because, and this was my own experience, and this has been influencing my own way of thinking about the classroom. There were some moments during the pandemic and teaching over Zoom that I thought were simply outstanding. I did more mentorship during the pandemic, I think,
Oh,
over Zoom, not
tell
unlike
me
what we're
about
doing right
that.
now.
Yeah, tell me about that.
So one-on-one conversations. And it really sort of hammered home for me that the best teaching occurs one-on-one or in very small groups, 2 or 3 students. If you need a model, it'd be like the Oxford tutorial. And I
Okay,
did a
I'm
fair
not
amount of
familiar with that.
so sitting in professors' rooms, offices, and two or three students at a time, having a discussion, having a conversation about a text or some sort of subject matter, as opposed to the lecturer to 50 or 100 or 200 students. Small, intimate, conversation, dialogue driven education. And frankly, it's becoming my preferred method to teach. I do a lot of independent studies. I have students ask me to do independent studies. I always say yes. I'm doing 5 this semester
Wow. Okay.
with a variety of students. And
And
again, we sit
is
in my
that
office and we have conversation.
yeah, I mean, is that difficult to manage in terms of your schedule?
um, so no, I guess the simple answer is no. No, I find time. We find time in the schedule. In fact, in some ways, it makes it easier. The reason I hesitate, Melinda, is I would I would rather all of my teaching be in that form, conversational, and a student or two at a time. The problem is, of course, that's terribly inefficient. It's much more efficient for me to teach 1 or 2 classes with 50 students as
Yeah.
opposed to many classes with 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 students,
Well, yeah,
even
I
if
mean,
that's pedagogically superior.
from maybe the authority standpoint, but like from your standpoint, I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is like, it sounds like it's worth it to you, to make the time. And what is it about that makes it just like an easy decision for you?
To me, it is real teaching and learning, real education. In fact, maybe it is it's sort of education. It is, the teacher and the student sitting on the tree stump together, right? I forget who said that, but it goes back to Plato and Aristotle, our notions about what schooling can or should be, what education can or should be. And again, I've come to this realization after the experience of the pandemic, because we were moving into Zoom. I found teaching in that sort of format, again, like what we're
Mhm.
engaged in right now, worked
Yeah.
really well. Worked really,
Yeah.
really well.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'd like to
I
think there's a future of higher education that looks something like that. I think that's pretty unlikely, but if I were designing a university of the future, it would look more like that.
Mhm. I appreciate that because I often don't count that. Um, Despite the fact that is generally the way I'm teaching because I have interns, I'm very, committed to mentorship. Um, I much prefer experiential learning, so because of the one-on-one potential it unlocks, so one of my favorite things is, I organize study tours for teachers to
Mhm.
go to Turkey, and it was all about communication, and reflecting on, well, what do we just do? What do we learn from it? People talking to each other. So it's like multiple one-on-ones, like the peer aspect gets unlocked as well, if you kind of just really change your thinking about, well, what is education? But I like that you called it teaching too, because that recognizes that teaching isn't just oration, maybe.
Right. Right. No, and that's beautifully stated. But I think, and I don't want to point specific fingers, but I think that we too often equate teaching with oration.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And that anything that deviates from that somehow isn't teaching, or is bad teaching, or is something else. Why not focus on the teaching? Um, yeah, I don't want to throw any sort of institutions under the bus. So
Well,
let me
I
just say
mean,
it
we're
like
all
that.
in it together. Like that's
Yeah.
kind of like the "we're nearly there" podcast theme, kind of, because also students expect that, and they might feel like just to play devil's advocate, I might be coming in there. I just spent a lot of money. I want some damn teaching, meaning like I want an expert up there who really knows their stuff, explaining it, and I have special access to that in a room with them. That could be a very valid perspective that I think, I mean, I definitely recognize and understand. It's just that, you know, what if that was just one of many learning experiences throughout the day? Because actually, you can't absorb more than, I think, 15 minutes of that without
Um,
dialogue. I think, and I think,
Dialogue.
yeah.
Well, see, we're at 35 minutes right now. So
Right.
does that imply that for dialogue, for conversation to work, that the partners in conversation have to be what, at the same sort of level, or at the same sort of level of experience? In other words, you and I can have conversation. We're both, academics. We both have PhDs, but that, say, teacher learner, teacher undergraduate, that it's harder to sustain that sort of conversation.
Yeah, I mean, just from an educational standpoint, you always have to think about prior knowledge. There's no, I don't, I think it's kind of like a natural law, so to speak. If someone doesn't have the background to talk about the subject, you've got to give it to them. You know?
That's true. No,
Yeah.
that's absolutely true. And then one question becomes, how does that happen? And one way, of course, is lecture.
Hmm.
Another way is, and what I do with some of my students is, um, read an article, or to get to a level of knowledge that allows
Hmm.
us then to have a conversation. And I want to just affirm, I guess, a point you made a minute or two ago, that maybe I misspoke, or I was too excited or something, to sort of say that all education has to look like this. It doesn't. You're right. We can have different sorts of modes. Maybe there is some value in the 1,000-person lecture. But I guess part of what I'm saying is maybe we need to create more space for that kind of
Yes. A
mentorship and
lot more
conversation.
space.
Yeah,
Like make our normal education occur 10% of the time.
yeah.
This is where I'm getting more committed to a stance now is, and I don't want to get preachy, but I really think,
Preach.
preach. I'm going to, preach the good word right now. We only need 10% of our learning activity to be content. Like we need it to be about creativity, excitement, tapping into our assets and our potential. That should be the focus. Mastering all these subjects really should be relevant to um, mastering ourselves, if
Mhm.
that makes sense.
It
It, it,
does.
it should be a whole person process, which means it's not saying, oh, there's the knower up on the stage. That immediately disempowers you to be the knower immediately. So it's actually not a good starting point. It's fine, but it should be minimalized way, like extreme, like in my opinion, like very extremely compared to most of my colleagues and friends I work with. We still go back to, well, we got to fill the schedule with knowers and experts or people aren't going to value this. It's like, well, maybe if they value themselves and what results they're going to get from the experience, we don't have to worry about that too much. We just need one kind of superstar that knows something really amazing and is passionate about it, and we can unwrap that baby for, I don't know how many more hours, like compared to that 1 hour of lecture. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, it does. Yeah. Um, so as we're having this conversation, I think that part of the pushback that I sometimes hear, especially to dialogue and conversation as a pedagogical tool. And by the way, this is in reference to your question about what the classroom looks like. Obviously, in the vision I have here, it's a very different kind of space, both in terms of its size and its location. Conversation can occur anywhere. I've had independent studies at Cafe Kerouac. I've had it at Hangover Easy and restaurants and those sorts of places.
Okay, yeah, talk about that. I
Well,
mean,
so I
what would it
will,
look
but I
like?
just want to make the point that
Okay.
part of the pushback I sometimes get is,
Hmm.
because conversation is a self-organizing process, because there are emergent behaviors, because Sometimes we can digress. It's difficult, and indeed, I think, not at all desirable to have control over the situation. I have this content to cover, or
Yeah.
by the end of 55 minutes, I need to, have you here. And oftentimes dialogue and conversation can wander off into unplanned directions. And I think this makes it especially problematic in a managerial culture where we have learning outcomes to meet and other sorts of metrics that have to be established.
Yeah.
And when conversation is occurring, when that becomes the pedagogical basis, when dialogue rather than monologue is what drives the learning or what drives education, it can be very difficult to manage and control, and thus can be very anarchic. So you were asking about classes I've taught. Yeah, I taught at least one class of about 4 students, and we met at Cafe Kerouac every week, once a week,
Yep.
yeah, right there by the
I know it.
where the baristas are.
Yeah.
And some of that was meeting them where they are. Some said, it was easier for them to go to Cafe Kerouac than to come all the way into campus. But I think I also did it in some ways to break out of the confines of the classroom or even the seminar room, and to sort of suggest that that a classroom can be made from any space.
I like that. And I like that you also addressed the time issue. I asked you about space and then you answered with time, which actually
Right.
is cool because it's time space is, supposedly where we're existing right now. And it does change the quality when there's a time container that's a hard stop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. That was something else I think that we discovered during the pandemic, and I think this is what we're learning about online education. Notice I didn't say distance education. I think that anytime we say distance education, that is old-fashioned thinking. Most
Okay.
students that I ask or that I talk to say that it's not about distance; it's about time. They take online courses, especially asynchronous courses, because it fits their schedules better. They have more control over their time.
Oh yeah. Amen to that. I am so spoiled now, since the pandemic. I really developed my own rhythms and patterns for productivity, and balancing lots of different things. And became, I developed cave syndrome. I just love my creature comforts now too much. So I'm breaking out more, and I'm forcing myself to go to the office. It's not a force. Like once I'm there, I'm like, yay, and I see my colleagues, But
Well, let me ask you this, Melinda.
mhm.
So we've seen in the sort of the world of work, the office culture, there's been, I think there's been a real turn, maybe an irreversible turn to remote work as the standard and
Mhm.
remote workers. Do you see something like that happening in higher education? Will we start talking about remote higher education as the standard, not as the occasional or the exceptional sort of activity?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm afraid we're not thinking that through enough, actually. Um, like I'm glad there was a task force, but there needs to be like some commitments made at any university. I don't want to name names, but you mentioned earlier, like this task force about, is it going to be hybrid? What's the role of the classroom? That is a great question.
Mhm.
And it needs to be an iterative process we are consciously working through, you know?
Do you think students are would rather be remote students than sort of in a physical classroom? Again, we don't necessarily use that term, but are you seeing more remote students?
Well, so there's two questions there. The first one's about what do students prefer? Um, I think it really has a lot. It's like the interface of their circumstances with their personality and what they need for learning socially. And I think we all need an initial rapport building phase with each other, because trust is it can't be bypassed for almost any human endeavor. Like you know, it's just so critical for like this dialogical learning that we're talking about, and just really anything. Like if you want to have like team-based projects, group assignments or anything. So long story short, there needs to be some as close to real life, I think, in the beginning of a class for to have a feeling of these are human beings I'm with here, and I think we all need that. Some of us would rather stay like me and like want to stay in my cave maybe too much, but we all need to get out and I think have, being social, it takes practice. Like I felt really out of practice, to be honest, like at the first physical space thing I went to. I'm like, I used to know how to do this and I clearly don't anymore. Like so yes, but I really want to think through these questions. I think the gift of the pandemic is that we're consciously thinking through communication and community and just communication. Like what is the communication needed now for this discussion, this topic? Is it a yes, no? Is it a straightforward yes, no? Is it more complicated than that? And then I think you're needing at least Zoom, at least real time conversation, maybe phone or whatever. But if it's a really difficult conversation, I mean, you need to be in person, I think, if at all possible. Like think about maybe the death of a loved one. Think about the worst, most difficult conversations. I only bring that up to clarify that there's a spectrum where in-person really, I think, is very important and will always remain important because of our brains and everything, like, because I think actually it's Goleman. Everyone's kind of heard of emotional intelligence. Goleman also wrote about social intelligence and talked about how, provided studies and evidence that actually a large portion of our communication is actually tone of voice and gestures and facial expression, like 90%. And we tend to think it's all words, but so what that means is actually when we're reading text, we are imagining facial expressions, tone of voice that are probably incorrect. Like the meaning is not quite fully there, so when you need the full meaning to be there, you kind of need to be with each other.
That's why teaching with masks was so challenging for me. It was hard for me to pick up on gesture and facial expression. I mean, eyes can tell a lot, but that was a big part of the challenge for me, teaching with a mask on, and with students with masks on.
Absolutely.
We needed to wear masks. I want to stress that. We needed to wear masks, but that was part of the challenge.
Yeah, it was very challenging. And let's face it, it did a lot of harm to many people. But the gift, like I said, is that, I think it forced us to consciously think through these questions. And my fear is that we'll stop now that it's less urgent. But my commitment personally is to just have kind of a communication philosophy going forward, having to do with these, questions of hybrid versus online versus in person. And I really enjoy hybrid. I think it's amazing, but I also now recognize how much it takes. Like it takes pretty much a movie production crew to actually make it feel seamless and truly hybrid. So we need to think about that as well. Like all the different people and resources involved in our experiences.
Have we exhausted discussion of the future of higher education?
No way. No way. But I love the topic of anarchy, and the I'm reading a book called Free Play, and that just keeps coming to mind, like this image of the rocks and the waves, you know, that you, or like animals playing, like there's a certain level of unpredictable play in nature. But when it hits the rocks of rules, limits, structure, that's creation. That's literally creation. Life. That's like creating life, you know? Yeah, and that's really what that evoked, you know, for me. And
That
it's,
was another chapter in my book was what if we put play at the center of the university as even above knowledge? What if we had an institution that was devoted to play?
wow.
And we really don't have that. We really don't have anything like that in our society.
Or like joy, you know, like joy. Like I'm a big believer that the path to happiness is happiness, you know. And I completely validate sometimes you're just not there, you're not feeling happy, you know. It's all about being real too. But if you have no hope of play or happiness, I mean, how are you supposed to get there, you know? How are you supposed to get to be human, you know? I mean, it's very important, you know, to make a space for it. And some people make the space at church maybe, or family, or, you know, but it should be, yeah, absolutely, it should be also inside of our workplace and our educational places, you know.
And you know, to repeat a theme, play in its pure form, creative play in its pure form, as opposed to say games. Play is in many ways very anarchic. It's unplanned. There's a lot of emergent behaviors. I mean, think about, you know, a simple case like a sandbox. A sandbox isn't compelling you to do a certain thing, but you give, you know, children the opportunity to play in a sandbox, and you know, it's interesting to see what emerges from their play, as opposed to you know, go on the swings,
Mm.
tells a certain kind of activity. That's the sense I mean play, and play again is very anarchic in that regard, and also very difficult to plan for and control and to manage. Which is why sometimes I think that's maybe the biggest reason why it's not a more central feature of the university, because we can't manage
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, again, going back to what's considered heroic and laudable and worthy of titles and pay and all those things is more executable or predictable. And there needs to be somehow, we need to just widen the circle. I keep going back to that. I'm not saying we need to get rid of authority or rules or some nugget from that hierarchical structure, but we really don't need that much of it. Really, I
a
don't,
different
you
way of
know.
thinking about what that leadership is, thinking about what its purpose is, who it's serving at
Yes.
the end. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Because it's so narrow in scope, and it leaves a lot of people out, you know, seriously. So, yeah. So we've got 3 more minutes officially. We could go a little over, but I wanna respect your time because I know you've got classes to teach and all those things. Is there anything you wanna share? Like, what are you working on right now? What are your books? What are your projects you wanna get people on board with?
I'm very excited to announce that. So this book is coming out in March 21st. So I want to put that plug in.
Yeah.
But I will tell you about the project I'm working on now that has got me really excited. And I'd be interested in your feedback and others' feedback. So I've long had an interest in biography as a genre, as a form.
Mhm.
And I always said to myself, my next project or a project is going to involve writing a biography. And I thought I had the subject. I started research on William Oxley Thompson,
Okay.
the fifth president of this university,
Yeah.
longest serving president.
Yeah.
And, you know, and that's going to be an interesting project. And I started it, but, you know, I just didn't have sort of the passion for it. I'm a futurist, as you know, Melinda. I'm very interested in studying the future.
Mhm.
And in July last summer, I had an epiphany. So my next project is going to be writing the biographies, plural, of future people.
Ooh.
And I've started writing this so we've been talking about the future of higher education. What if we think about the future not as scenarios, not in terms of predictions, but in how individuals will live in the future and what their
Yes.
individual story is. So that's my next project. I'm writing about 15 or so biographies of people who live in the future.
Wow. Awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that reaction. That's the sort of reaction I want.
Well, I love sci-fi and speculative fiction, so I'm thinking, characters in a universe kind of
Speculative
thing.
biography. You just
Okay.
got my name for it.
Speculative biography.
Yep, I've been trying to wrap my head around what it is I'm trying to write. And it's not going to fit any sort of category, which is, I think, going to make it maybe a challenge to get it published because it doesn't fit a neat category. But speculative biography, I think that's a term I'm going to start using. And I'll have to quote you, Melinda.
Oh, nice. I love it. And have you read Ender's Game? It's a great book with a very strong central character. Yeah. So
I have. I've not seen the movie, but I have read the book.
it's me too. Yeah, I haven't seen the movie, but it's just I love it because it's like it helped me understand weightlessness. Like the experience, the physical experience of it. And I love speculative fiction. So sounds exciting. Sounds like, and
I
what's
am
the name of
very,
that book
very
that's
excited
coming
by
out? What's the name of the book that's coming out?
this. Knowledge Towns.
Knowledge Towns. Okay, yeah, and I
Yep,
captured
that's
that in your
coming out
bio.
in March.
Nice. I didn't realize that was your most recent one.
Mhm.
Got it. All right. Well, our time is up. So I apologize to anyone who was trying to sign in and had issues. I'm still learning some of these platforms like LinkedIn and stuff. And thanks for letting me know. I'll look into it and see if I can prevent the issues next time. So, and thank you again, David, for joining me for this past hour and yeah, for this awesome dialogue. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.